Our next paper is by Keaton Vanderploeg, who is a local of Flagstaff, bless you, and works as an educational tour guide inside Grand Canyon National Park. He grew up in Arizona and attended Arizona State University, where he received degrees in life sciences and history. Fascinated with the ecology and human history of Grand Canyon National Park, he moved to Flagstaff and began work with Canyon Dave Tours in 2017, spending this time learning more about the park and surrounding areas. His paper is Pete Berry, Looking for Grand View.
Hi guys. So if you've ever been out to Grand View Point, you've probably seen a couple of these photos. Pete Berry was the first hotel operator at the Grand Canyon, so we're going to talk about him today. So in his early life, he was born in Iowa in 1858, but by 1866, his family had moved to Missouri. He was the youngest of 8 children, and in 1879, him and his older brother John moved to Pitkin, Colorado, where they tried their hand at mining. And while Pete might have enjoyed the miner's life, it seemed like John was looking for other Western ventures. So in 1883, John left Colorado and moved to the brand new town of Flagstaff, Arizona. In Flagstaff, John Berry opened the San Juan Saloon on Railroad Avenue, which is now Route 66. It soon became one of the town's most popular businesses. It had a great location next to the train depot, and Berry offered fine cigars, wines, spirits. Gambling was popular. He brought in a piano and boasted, "If you want to hear good music, go to the San Juan." With the addition of a lunch counter and a barber shop, the saloon was a popular place day or night. And by 1886, John had expanded his business, and he was focused on building a broker's office in Flagstaff. His success led to him running for county sheriff in that same year. However, tragedy was waiting around the corner for John Berry. On January 17th, 1887, a bar fight broke out in the San Juan. George Hawks and his brother William had pistol whipped another cowboy for singing too loud all night. After the assault, George tried to flee, but was detained by other bar patrons. When Berry came to wrestle the pistol away from George, a shot went off and Berry was struck through the gut. At 6:30 the next morning, John Berry would succumb to his wound. And at the same time, George and Williams were both arrested and jailed for the murder. Outraged at the death of one of Flagstaff's most popular citizens, 20 vigilantes gathered together, stormed the jail, suppressed the guards, and killed both George and Will before a trial could be conducted. That week, all the saloons in Flagstaff were closed to mourn the loss of John Berry. And at the end of the week, 3 funerals were held, one for John Berry, one for George Hawks, and one for William Hawks. During his time in Flagstaff, John had built his business along with a family. When he died, he left behind his wife May and a son Newton. When word of John's death reached Pete in Colorado, the younger Berry would pack up his things and head towards Flagstaff to fill the roles John left behind. By September 1887, Pete Berry had taken over as owner of the San Juan Saloon. He was also taking care of May and Newton Berry. However, less than a year after his arrival, on July 9th, 1888, Flagstaff experienced one of its many catastrophic fires. During the fire, the San Juan Saloon would be destroyed, and Pete lost an estimated $5,000 in the disaster. But the resilient Pete would stay in Flagstaff. He married his brother's widow, and in the spring of 1889, the couple would have their own son, Ralph. After the fire, Pete's saloon business was never the same. It was around this time that Berry would join the Cameron brothers, Ralph, Niles, and Burton, on prospecting trips into the Grand Canyon. Guided by John Hance, the Cameron brothers and Pete Berry would spend days and weeks prospecting inter-canyon sites. During this time, dozens of claims, including the Last Chance, were established, and in June 1892, Berry wrote in his notes, "Ralph struck the bonanza. We worked on it till 6 p.m. and dug it all out. At 4 p.m., we were ragged, assayed millionaires. At 6 p.m., no millionaire, but ragged-assed all the same. Once the men had found their bonanza, the miners realized they needed a better route to reach the location atop Horseshoe Mesa. Originally, using the Hance route into the canyon, then trekking around Horseshoe Mesa to come up Cottonwood Canyon to the west, Barry now needed a better trail for mules and a faster route if he was going to realize the mining potential at Last Chance. After selecting a route, cutting timber, and preparing for the hard work ahead, on July 20th, 1892, the men started building what would become the Grandview Trail. For the next 6 months, Pete Barry, the Cameron brothers, Ed Gale, and Dave Von Nita worked dawn till dusk, 7 days a week, to build a trail that would eventually travel 3.5 miles and 2,500 feet down into the Grand Canyon. The original trailhead was about 1.5 miles southeast of where Grandview Trail enters the canyon today. At the trailhead, there was a mill site where they lumbered the local ponderosa pine that would be chained to the walls of the Grand Canyon for construction of the trail. A cabin was built in this area as the basis of operations for the work. By February 1893, after 6 months of hard labor and an investment estimated at $12,000, the trail was complete. Almost immediately after completing the trail, the group would work on hauling a chunk of copper out of the canyon that would go on to win first prize at the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. The nugget was 70% pure copper and weighed over 600 pounds. It took 6 men, 6 days to move it from Horseshoe Mesa up the Grandview Trail to the rim of the canyon. After the fair, the nugget was sold to the Chicago Field Museum for $1 per pound. Now, the primary purpose of the trail was for mining, so the next step was building a mining camp. On Horseshoe Mesa, Barry would build a dining hall, kitchen, blacksmith, and enough bunkhouses to accommodate up to 20 employees who could each earn up to $5 a day. Every day, the copper ore would be hauled out of the canyon by 8 to 10 mules, each carrying 200 pounds at a time. From there, a stagecoach would take 1 ton of ore from Grandview to Flagstaff. The ore was then loaded onto trains and shipped to El Paso, Texas for refining. In total, 140 train car loads would be shipped to Texas between 1893 and 1902. The Last Chance mine was the most productive and valuable of Grand Canyon's pioneer era, but the high cost of moving the ore from the mine to the rim to the train and then out to the refinery made profit margins desperately thin. It was around this same time that more and more tourists began to arrive, and Barry saw the potential to expand his homestead and trail into an exciting new venture. The exploration of the Colorado River and its canyons by John Wesley Powell started circulating the United States in the 1870s. Powell's first-hand account of navigating the wild Colorado River was an incredible tale that described a Grand Canyon too enormous, too wild, and too beautiful for readers to comprehend. Paintings by Thomas Moran tried to unveil the canyon to those living in the cities along the East Coast, and by the 1880s, trains had arrived in northern Arizona. The first sightseers would venture out from Flagstaff to see if the stories of Grand Canyon were true. Guided by John Hance and the Hull family, the first tourists arrived in 1884. Hance was a terrific storyteller, but his cabins and tents left a lot to be desired by travelers who had taken a 12-hour, sometimes 2 to 3 day-long stagecoach ride to arrive at the South Rim. Pete Barry saw this potential business and began housing tourists in his cabin built for trail work. Mules he used for mining could be used to give guided expeditions down the Grandview Trail. His vision grew, he expanded the cabin layout, and in 1897, the Grandview Hotel officially opened for business. Around the same time, miners on Horseshoe Mesa found massive caves embedded in the limestone. Barry began to advertise these caverns as similar to Mammoth Cave, adding an exciting destination at the end of the Grandview Trail. By the end of the century, Pete Barry had the nicest hotel, best trail, and most exciting excursions available for early travelers. Grandview had become the canyon's most popular destination. Pete's life as a prospector and commitment to building the Grandview Trail in the early 1890s would eventually take its toll on his personal life. Once the mining operation began, Pete's days of comfort in Flagstaff were few and far between. In 1945, William Dowling, an employee of the Grand Canyon National Park and an acquaintance of Pete Berry, was interviewed on the early life and times of the canyon's pioneers. Dowling's story was that in the fall of 1893, May Berry ran off to Tucson with a traveling salesman and Pete's young son, Ralph. In response, Pete paid Niles Cameron $100 to track down and retrieve his boy. Ralph was retrieved, and while the couple worked towards a divorce, Pete's son was sent to the Sisters of Charity in San Miguel, New Mexico for care. In March of 1894, the divorce was finalized, custody of Ralph was held in abeyance, and would remain with the sisters for a time. The San Juan property, now East Santa Fe, or 6 East Santa Fe, was sold during the divorce. Traded a handful of times, it lives on today where Karma Sushi in Flagstaff is. When the Santa Fe Railroad completed the Grand Canyon line in 1901, what had taken 12 hours could now be done in 3. The cost of travel went from $20 to $3.95. But Pete Berry did not work for the railroad, and the train tracks ended nearly 14 miles west of the Grandview Hotel. At the start of the 20th century, tours can now get to the canyon on a train, but it still required one more stagecoach ride to get to Grandview. Berry offered a free ride to his hotel from the train, and once there, guests would pay $2 per day for a room. Guided trips into the canyon, led by Berry, John Hance, or Louis Boucher, cost $3.40 a day. A saddle tour along the rim was $1.25, and while for just $1, 2 or more people could take a carriage ride from the hotel out to where Grandview Point is today. It was also around this time the new trailhead was built. In the 1800s, tourists entered the canyon where the hotel was located and skirted underneath the rim until merging with today's trail at the Coconino Saddle. Today's trailhead at Grandview Point was developed as an easier entry for tourists, and its use started in 1902. There was a common theme among Grand Canyon pioneers. Men like Hance, Cameron, and Berry, who first arrived as prospectors and miners, would all become hotel operators and tour guides. Tourism was the real gold mine at the Grand Canyon, but mining was hard and costly. So in 1902, Berry and the Camerons sold Last Chance to Henry P. Barber of Chicago, who in turn sold it to J.H. Page, and the Canyon Copper Company formed. The Canyon Copper Company would eventually haul over 900,000 pounds of copper and 141,000 pounds of silver out of the Grand Canyon, all on the backs of mules, before the mine shut down in 1907. Berry and the Camerons received $35,000 from the sale and would turn their interest towards the growing tourism demand of Grand Canyon. Part of the sale, though, involved J.H. Page acquiring the Grandview Hotel and the Grandview Trail. Berry continued to stay on at Grandview, managing the hotel, mining operation, guided tours, all for his new investors. It was around this time a tourist named Martha Thompson would arrive at the canyon. Martha seemed to enjoy the view Pete had built for himself, and she would stay on as housekeeper for the hotel. According to the local news, Pete and Martha married on the morning of August 26, 1903, which it was a surprise to their friends and community, as no one had known of their plans until after the fact. According to the Dowling interview, one morning after a night of heavy drinking, Pete woke up next to Martha without any memory, but with a new certificate of marriage. Either way, the newly married couple would return to the Grand Canyon and spend the rest of their lives together. With a new partner, steady stream of tourists, and money in his pocket, Berry looked beyond the Grandview to build a bigger, more substantial property at the Grand Canyon. In 1903, Berry began shipping in lumber from Flagstaff. Next to his log cabin, he would build a 3-story framed hotel. Boasting it as the nicest hotel at the highest point along the rim, the Summit Hotel was a substantial upgrade from Grandview. The neighboring hotels, Grandview and Summit, competed for a few months until the Canyon Copper Company stepped in once again and acquired the Summit. The name Grandview now included the original log cabin, the newer, bigger building, the nicest trail, the most productive mine, and the largest tourist destination around, but all of this could not prevent the inevitable. Everyone came to the canyon on train. The Santa Fe Railroad worked closely with the Fred Harvey Company, and the Fred Harvey Company was known the world over for its own hotels and tourism. While the expansions at Grandview were completed, the railroad began construction of their own multi-story hotel right at the train depot. In January of 1905, the El Tovar opened for business. There was no longer an incentive to take the 14-mile-long stagecoach ride to Grandview. Barry saw fewer and fewer tourists as he experienced his heaviest competition to date. For the next 2 years, Barry struggled to maintain everything he had built in the canyon. By 1907, the hotel was seeing only a handful of other people every other week, and at the same time, the copper prices dropped around the country. The Canyon Copper Company shut down mining operations on Horseshoe Mesa and also began to look at the hotel operations with similar skepticism. In 1908, Theodore Roosevelt declared the walls of the Grand Canyon a national monument, which was a big step for the national park history, but a big blow to small entrepreneurs like Pete Barry. From 1908 to 1910, the hotel stood vacant, with only Pete and Martha staying on as caretakers. In 1911, Barry reopened the property, hoping to compete with Grand Canyon Village. He offered locals cheap land on his homestead to develop the town of Summit, but unfortunately found no takers, and still no visitors. Determined to never see his property end up in the hands of Fred Harvey, Pete Barry and the Canyon Copper Company began looking for a single buyer with deep pockets to take up their mantle. In 1913, a deal was struck with multimillionaire William Randolph Hearst to acquire everything. The Barry homestead was sold for $48,618. The Canyon Copper Company was sold for $25,618. A nearly $75,000 deal in 1913 would be worth over $2 million today, and Pete Barry would walk away a considerably richer man. Hearst would make great claims of building himself an estate, a bigger hotel, a faster railroad, and more accommodations to compete with Fred Harvey, all of which never came to fruition. Hearst would, however, be a thorn in the side of the national parks as it developed in the 1920s. Mather's vision for national parks required the elimination of private holdings within the boundaries of the Grand Canyon. Negotiations with Hearst lasted for 2 decades, during which time the original Grandview Hotel was torn down in 1928. Eventually, Congress reworked wartime powers from 1918 to give the national parks more power to acquire these private holdings. In 1939, these laws allowed for the filing of a declaration of taking against the 200 acres owned by Hearst. The park valued the land at $25,000. Hearst said it was worth $367,000. A legal battle ensued, but in 1940, a federal judge ruled the government would pay Hearst $85,000 for the property, and the matter was settled. After Pete Barry sold his property to Hearst, he used his wealth to buy a car. He also got his son a ranch, and Ralph began ranching in the Coconino Basin about 8 miles from Grandview. Things were good for the Barrys. Now it was Hearst's problem to deal with Fred Harvey. Ralph's ranch was doing well, and even in dry years produced bumper crops of oats, rye, and potatoes. The newspapers declared him the young Spud King of the North. Sometime after 1916, Pete and Martha moved to San Gabriel, California, seemingly to retire on the money earned in the Hearst sale. But Pete Barry could not go long without a stroke of bad luck. In 1919, Ralph, the young Spud King, would catch the Spanish flu, and within a week, he would die. Pete was there at his son's side when he passed away at the age of 29. A funeral was held at Grand Canyon, which saw the reunion of Ralph's family. Pete and Martha came in from California, his mother May and brother Newton from Phoenix. This may have been the first time the Barry family had been together since Pete and May's divorce 25 years earlier. The loss of their son brought Pete and Martha back to the canyon. They moved into Ralph's ranch, where they remained for another decade. Now into their 60s, the Barrys lived out a quiet life with occasional visitors from friends and park rangers looking for the canyon wisdom of old-timers like Pete. In 1931, Martha passed away, and Pete buried her at the canyon next to their son Ralph. A year later, Pete would die of stomach cancer, joining his son and wife in the Grand Canyon's Pioneer Cemetery. That same year, the original logs of the Grandview Hotel would be used in the construction of Desert View Watchtower, the only pieces of the hotel visitors can still see today. After Barry's death and the acquisition of Grandview by the National Park, the remaining material at Grandview and Summit Hotel were removed and the area returned to nature. The mine camp on Horseshoe Mesa crumbled and faded away. A few stone walls and gated-off mine shafts are all that remain. For nearly 50 years, Pete Barry's vision of Grandview was the foundation of what would become the Grand Canyon National Park. His ability to host and guide tourists has grown into a billion-dollar industry. While little physically remains of his legacy, the work he put in will not be forgotten. And today you can still take a tour along the rim and go to Grandview Point, see the old black and white photos of his family and hotel. You can still hike the Grandview Trail to Horseshoe Mesa, and you can still get a sense of what life was like when the first tourists arrived in the 1800s. And I'd just like to say thanks to these particular sources. Dick Brown wrote about Pete Barry in The Old Pioneer. That's a great article. Of course, Michael Anderson's Living on the Edge. And in particular, Deborah Sutphin. She wrote 2 pieces, Too Hard a Nut to Crack in the Journal of Arizona History, and her dissertation on the Grandview, Hermit, and South Kaibab trails has way, way more information about Pete Barry. So if you guys ever want to learn more about Pete, I recommend those sources. And also, thanks to the Grand Canyon Archives, Kim Bessem sent me some information that was very helpful, and the NAU archives were also very helpful. Awesome, guys. Thank you.